Welcome. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this program called Journey in Consciousness, which is an introduction to the teachings and life work of a man named Meher Baba. And my name is Daniel Stone, and I'll be with you throughout this journey. And I'd like us to start really with a moment of silence so that we can all connect to the spirit within ourselves and connect to the source of that spirit that resides within each one of us. So I do welcome you all. I'm really excited that you're all here. And I really want to send greetings to you all, and also to those folks who will be watching this on the recording after the fact. I had no idea how many folks would show up, and there's something like 140 folks have signed up for this, and they're from all around the US and around the world. So there are folks I know from India and Europe and throughout the United States and maybe elsewhere. So welcome here. And I've been really giving a lot of thought as I've created this program about how I wanted to open the program. And what came to me was that I think I don't know very many of you who have signed up for this program. I know some of you, and most of you are unknown to me personally, but I have a hunch that we all share something really in common. And that is that I think all of us here are here because we're in search of something. We're in search of some kind of higher experience, some kind of experience of who we really are in our true nature, and to uncover that, and that uncovering is a journey in and of itself. And I also know that every single person who is here on this call is on their own journey, and each of our journeys are unique to each one of us. And that's just as it should be, because the path to God is always individual. But I thought I'd start out by saying a little bit about my own journey in consciousness, just to set the stage, because I'm going to be your tour guide throughout these 7 sessions. And so sometimes it's helpful to know something about the person who you'll be listening to. So I consciously started my own journey in consciousness back when I was a teenager. And I grew up in the era that some would call the hippie era of the 1960s, and I was a hippie. And in that regard, as that era was characterized by lots of experimentation of all sorts. And one of those was, of course, experimentation with higher consciousness. And in that regard, when I was in my mid-teens, I did have an experience, a chemically induced experience that exposed me to a higher level of consciousness myself than I'd ever experienced before. And it was a wondrous experience. It was something far beyond anything I'd ever experienced before. And it was an experience of oneness and connection with all, and really speaking of love. And it was an experience that even though the chemicals wore off, but that the sense of that experience actually stayed with me for quite some time. And then after that, I tried to replicate that experience through other kinds of means, other kind of chemical means that actually didn't take me to the same place. But the experience was so profound and so important to me that it stayed with me. And over time, I began to be exposed to the work of other people who had these kinds of very advanced experiences of consciousness. And I learned that there really were ways to work on one's own consciousness, to try to progress one's own consciousness without chemical means. And so that began a process of exploring the worlds of yoga and meditation and kind of what we would call mysticism. And in that regard, I was exposed to lots of different teachings of lots of different people. and read wonderful books and great books. And during that period, this was the late 60s, early 70s, I was given a copy of a book that was written by a man named Meher Baba. And when I read that book, it had a very profound impact on me, because it was clear to me that it was being written from a place that I had not felt from any of the other books I'd read before, that it was written from a place of someone who was speaking from a place where they were already in that place of having perfected their consciousness. And they were facing back to those of us, and me in particular, who was trying to move in that direction, to explain, so here's what the path is all about, and here's how to pursue it. So it was a very profound experience I had in reading his teachings. But there was a couple of things that were really difficult for me and challenging at that time. And I want to put one of them right out on the table here, because it was very challenging for me, which was Meher Baba made it clear as to what his own spiritual status was and is. Because Meher Baba said that he is the avatar, not an avatar, but the avatar. And that's a very strong statement, because the avatar is a word, it comes from the Sanskrit, and it literally means descent, or sometimes I've read it's translated as descent into darkness. And it literally is about the descent of God directly from the state of godhood into the world of form. And Baba said that he is that current incarnation of the avatar that comes periodically to give a spiritual push to all in creation. And Baba said that the avatar has come previously in recorded history as Zoroaster, as Buddha, as Rama, Krishna, as Jesus, and as Muhammad. And now he said he's come again. Well, that was a huge claim, and I didn't know what to do with it. I come from a Jewish tradition, and basically I have a secular background from my family, so I really didn't know what to make of it. So I kind of set that aside. And the other thing that was not clear to me was, what does it mean to follow Baba? Because it was clear from reading him that following a master was actually an important part of the spiritual path. And I couldn't figure out, what does it mean to follow Baba? Because Baba didn't really give a set of methodologies like yoga and meditation and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of put Baba aside, and I continued with my own pursuits. And it's a long story about those pursuits, and I'm not going to go into it here. They're all recorded and available on YouTube, and I'll make that information available on the website. But that pursuit eventually brought me to decide that I needed to find a master. And I took an overland trip back in 1972, that's nearly 50 years ago, across the East, across Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and eventually into India, where I did find a spiritual master, a great spiritual master, whose name is Neem Karoli Baba. And some of you may know who he is because he is the guru of Ram Dass, or at the time he was called Baba Ram Dass. And so when I was with Neem Karoli Baba, he gave me an experience of awakening. And it was so far beyond anything I'd ever experienced, way beyond what I'd experienced through chemical means, of experience of depth of awareness in my own heart. And that was the experience of waking. And it was just an incredible experience. And it was the fulfillment of what I'd been looking for. But I never felt that, and it's hard to explain this, that he was actually meant to be my master. And in fact, I felt him actually inwardly guiding me to go to Meher Baba, and which I did. And I went to the place where Meher Baba's his center is in central India, from where I was in northern India. And at that time, Meher Baba was no longer in the physical body. He had dropped his body, as we say, or died, it could be said, in 1969. This was 3 years later. And while I was there, Meher Baba gave me the exact same experience of awakening that I'd had with Neem Karoli Baba. And at the time that he gave it to me, it showed me that he really was my master. And so that's how I came to be a follower of Meher Baba. And it showed me also that in the case of Meher Baba and the case of a God-realized master like Meher Baba, that they are not dependent on their physical body in order for one to have a direct personal relationship with them. And so that was my experience there, and that's been my experience for 50 years in following him. Now, I also want to say something about Baba, because Baba's most important statement about himself and his mission as the avatar, and it's written on his tomb in India. He said, "I have come not to teach, but to awaken." In other words, he came to bring about a spiritual awakening amongst all in creation. That is the role of the avatar. And very specifically, to bring about an awakening of those people who are ready and spiritually receptive for that awakening. That's his role. Now, when he said, "I've come not to teach, but to awaken," that is what he said. It's also true that Meher Baba left behind a body of teachings, and they really fall into two camps. There's the teachings he gave about the nature of reality and creation and the purpose of creation. And he gave a comprehensive explanation about what is the purpose of creation and how does it actually work. Now, in my professional life, I'm a strategic organizational consultant, which means that I think in terms of systems. And what Meher Baba gave is certainly the most comprehensive systemic statement as to how creation actually works, including how all the parts fit together and how they all link together in order to achieve the ultimate purpose of creation. So it's really quite a magnificent thing that Baba gave behind about that. He also gave a body of teachings about the nature of the spiritual path and how one can then advance one's own consciousness within creation so that one can ultimately find oneself at the stage of complete and full realization of self-realization or God realization, which, as Baba said, is the ultimate fulfillment of self-realization. So he did leave behind those teachings. And so this program that I put together, that I've invited you into, and is one that will explore those teachings and will explore some of the things that Baba had to say about that. And we will then kind of talk about Baba himself, but we're starting with his teachings. But I wanted to do something before we get into the teachings, because the teachings, can be kind of abstract in a way. They can be a little bit like, we're going to be talking about things that are really outside, perhaps, of our immediate direct experience or our memory of experience that we carry with us. And so it's trying to understand what Baba had to say about that. And it's very beautiful and it's very important to understand. But it is of that nature. But before I do that, I wanted to give you a taste of who Baba was as a man, because Baba was a man and he lived quite an extraordinary life. And it's a life of very connected, especially with people. And I was also connected with animals and all in creation, but especially with people. And he was a very loving, very human kind of presence as he connected with people and connected with people's hearts. And I want to give you some flavor about that. Baba did say that to be perfectly spiritual means to be perfectly human. So I'm going to show you a clip, and it's a clip from a film that was taken in the 1950s. It's a short clip. It's only a minute and a half. And it will show you Baba. You'll see some scenes of Baba with some of his disciples, and you'll see a couple of scenes of Baba bathing and clothing a leper and bowing down to support people, because Baba did work with the poor and with the lepers as part of what he called his universal work. He would do these kinds of programs. So you'll see some of that. And you'll hear over the clip a message that Baba gave called How to Love God. And this is a message about us. It's for us to provide us with guidance. How do we actually live our lives in a way where we are loving God, which Baba said is the real purpose of our lives, is to learn to love God and live for God. And so this message is going to be read by a woman named Kitty Davy. And Kitty Davy was one of Baba's very first Western disciples. She's from England, so you'll hear her English accent, and she lived with Baba in India from 1937 to 1952, at which time Baba sent her to live and serve him through working at the Meher Spiritual Center, which is Baba's said is his home in the West. It's a retreat center located in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where I'm from. And so she lived there until 1991, and she died at the age of 100. But you'll hear her giving this message. And what's one of the things significant about that is you might ask yourself, well, why didn't Baba give the message himself? Why wasn't he the one reading it out? And the reason is quite simple. It's the beginning in the year 1925. Baba began external silence. Baba did not speak a single word from 1925 to the time that he dropped his body in 1969. Now, there must be a very significant reason that he kept that silence. And I believe it's for very esoteric and mystical reasons that are related to this universal work he did for the upliftment and the shifting of consciousness of all in creation. And Baba himself, he didn't exactly explain his silence, but he gave some signposts or indicators, and we'll be talking about that at some point in this program. But I'm not going to do that now. I just want you to see Baba in action. Now, I'm going to share my screen, and this is going to be a little awkward with Zoom, so hopefully you guys have probably spent enough time on Zoom, you know kind of how this drill works. But I'm going to show you this clip.
To love God in the most practical way is to love our fellow beings. If we feel for others in the same way as we feel for our own dear ones, we love God. If instead of seeing faults in others, we look within ourselves, we are loving God. If instead of robbing others to help ourselves, we rob ourselves to help others, we are loving God. If we suffer in the suffering of others and feel happy in the happiness of others, we are loving God. If instead of worrying over our own misfortunes, we think of ourselves more fortunate than many, many others, we are loving God. If we endure our lot with patience and contentment, accepting it as His will, we are loving God. If we understand and feel that the greatest act of devotion and worship to God is not to hurt or harm any of His beings, we are loving God. To love God as He ought to be loved, we must live for God and die for God, knowing that the goal of life is to love God and find Him as our own self.
So this is a program about consciousness. And I want to actually say something about consciousness itself, just before we begin our sort of exploration of the journey in consciousness, is to say this whole question of consciousness. I want to put on the table what has been, I think, a source of a great deal of controversy in the scientific arenas, philosophical arenas, and so on about consciousness, which is basically, does consciousness actually exist? Is there such a thing as consciousness? And if so, where is it? And how do you measure it? And there are those who would assert that there is no such thing, that consciousness is essentially brain activity, and it's all neural firings like that. Of course, the mystics over time have all said that consciousness is really the purpose of all of life, is to advance consciousness. And science is actually catching up with this in different kinds of ways. I know of a couple of different sources of evidence, and some of you probably know many more about what that evidence is, but there is more and more evidence that says consciousness actually is not equivalent to brain activity. And there's been instances of people having consciousness where there's actually been brain stoppage, and as measured by EEGs. And there's also very good evidence that's been accumulated that says consciousness is not only not associated with the brain, but it's also not directly associated with a single human form. The consciousness actually traverses across different human forms. And that sort of challenges basic premises of materiality. So this whole subject that we're in here about the journey in consciousness really is a really case in point of how science is in fact starting to catch up with the truths that have been told over the ages by all the great mystics. So having said that, I want to say something about this program and kind of where we're headed in this journey in consciousness, because, and a lot of this is on the website, you can get it there. But I want to say, we're going to start this program by talking about this, as I said, something called the divine theme, which is what Meher Baba's explanation is about creation and how creation, the purpose of creation, which is to serve, to help consciousness evolve from unconscious, infinite unconsciousness to infinite consciousness. And we'll talk about that in this session, and then we'll also finish that discussion next week in the next session, where we talk about a phase of the evolution of consciousness that Baba called involution, which is consciousness beyond what our normal gross physical experience of consciousness is. And it's a very major contribution that Baba made to the understanding of consciousness is through his explanations about the 6 planes of consciousness beyond the gross physical plane that one traverses on their journey home to full self-realization. Then our third session, what we'll do is we'll talk about what's the mechanism by which consciousness actually progresses. And we'll be talking and that's, I think, of special importance to those of us who are spiritually awakening, that we want to participate, we want to be part of the actual progression of our consciousness. So we'll be talking about the concept of karma, and a concept that Baba said was actually the foundation of all of his teachings, which is a concept that he calls sanskaras, or otherwise known as impressions of the mind. And these are the tendencies of the mind to identify itself with something other than knowing ourselves as our true selves, which is as infinite consciousness. And these sanskaras eventually have to be worked through and transcended. And Baba talks about the means by which sanskaras are in fact worked through and transcended. And Baba says that the most efficacious means for transcending these sanskaras is through the intervention and building a relationship with a master who is perfected. And so our fourth session, we'll talk about, well, what is a master? What is their role? How does one recognize a master? And how does one form a relationship with a master? And then that will naturally lead into the fifth session, which is going to be about a particular master. And that, of course, is Avatar Meher Baba, who is a perfected being. And we'll talk about what his life is. And again, it's going to be very much of an overview. Baba's life has been detailed through countless numbers of books and biographies, including one biography that's 20 volumes. That's a 20-volume biography, so we're clearly not going to cover all that. But we will give an overview of Baba's life, and we'll talk about what Baba's work was of a universal nature, because Baba said all of his whole life was and his whole work as the Avatar was focused on accomplishing the universal work, which was to bring about this shift in consciousness. And Baba said that shift in consciousness would be universal, and it would usher in a new era of humanity that Baba called the new humanity. And so the fifth session, we'll talk about the new humanity. And I think, these days it's talked about as the new age. Baba called it the new humanity, started talking about that all the way back in the 1930s. And so we'll talk about what Baba said would lead up to the new humanity, what would be the characteristics of it, And what can those of us who are spiritually awakening people, how can we actually contribute to bringing about this new era of humanity called the new humanity? So that'll be session number 6. And then the last session is going to be focused back on ourselves and our own path and our own spiritual path, whatever that is. And this is not, it may be with Meher Baba, it may be with another master, it may not be with the master, but what is that path? And Baba said that in the era of the avatar, whether you're a follower of his or not, this is an era where the most efficacious path back to God is what he calls the path of love. And so we'll talk about what is the path of love and do some self-reflection about ourselves and where are we in our own path back to God. So that's the journey that we're on, and hopefully you'll be with us for the whole journey. I want to say just a few additional comments about this program, just to sort of clarify. First of all these sessions are being recorded so that they'll all be available on the website. So, and I'll be posting the links on the website so you can find them. Also, there are readings and other materials like videos that you can find on the website according to each session. And these are all available for free. You know, Baba made it clear that that there should be no barrier to people in having access to God. And that includes financial barriers. And just like this program is being offered as for free, all of those materials are available for free as a download, or you can get them for free. You can get the videos for free, or you can purchase the books if you want, but they're all there. The third thing I want to say is I don't come to you as an academic, and I don't come to you as a scholar. I've been with Baba for 50 years. I've been learning as I go. I've met many of Baba's close disciples, what he called his mandali, and many of his close lovers, and I've been in conversations and readings and my own inner experience, and I've done a certain amount of synthesis, and that's what I'm here to share with you. And I don't claim that that I can answer every question, but I'm trying to be as open as I can about that. But I will certainly share what I have. And if you ask questions beyond my ability to answer them, I'll do my best to find the answer for you. So that's just a little bit about kind of what this program is about. So and the way the program will work is in each program, I'm going to do a presentation, and it'll be about somewhere close to an hour or so. And at the end of that, then we'll stop the recording, and then we'll do some breakout groups to give you a chance to kind of talk with a few other people here if you choose to stay on. You don't, obviously you can leave, but if you choose to stay on, to give you a chance to kind of connect with a few other people here, and we'll do that very randomly. So you'll probably meet some new people if you partake of that opportunity, just to digest and see what resonated for you, or what comments you have, or what questions you have. And then after the breakout groups, we'll open it up for questions and comments, and we'll keep that going, for as long as there seems to be good energy for it, or until we wear out. So that's kind of how the program goes. So now we're ready to actually begin the journey in consciousness. So this journey, and most of the rest of this presentation will be through PowerPoint. So I'm gonna shift to PowerPoint right now, and give myself a little laser there. And this, of course, this is Meher Baba. This is one of my favorite photographs of Baba. It was taken when Baba was in Washington, D.C. in 1952. It's colorized. So Baba gave us one of the great gifts and one of his real teachings, and it's something that Baba actually encouraged people to read and reread until it, as he would tell some people, read and reread it till it's singing in your veins, was a book called God Speaks. And it was the culmination of an evolution of teachings about what Baba called the divine theme. And this is Baba's explanation about the universe, about creation, where it comes from and what it's about. And so I'm going to be, and God Speaks, which I highly encourage you to read if you're at all, if this at all intrigues you, this conversation about this. But the book by God Speaks has numerous charts and graphs and so on. And in God Speaks, Baba really integrates across 4 or 5 major branches of mysticism that and really makes sense about what these different pathways, mystical paths are. And that includes Buddhism, Hinduism, which is at its core a mystical path, what we would call, what he calls mystical Christianity, which is the heart of Christianity, and Sufism, which of course is the mystical branch of Islam. So he integrates all of that, and in what he says. I'm not going to spend time doing that. That's certainly of interest to a lot of people who are interested in sort of the comparison across these different paths. But I'm going to give you what is the map that Baba gave here. And I want to be clear, you're getting my synthesis of this. It's really worth reading Baba's own words about this. Because in addition to the words and concepts, there is a kind of almost a spiritual transmission that I feel one gets when reads direct words from a God realized being. But I'm going to give you my synthesis about what Baba said. And Baba said that creation actually wasn't the beginning. Baba actually, he said there is no such thing as a beginning. Because there is no such thing as time and space in reality. But Baba uses certain terms to try to at least help us grasp what some of these things are. And Baba uses the term, in the beginningless beginning, God was. But God was in what he called the beyond state of God. And this is the state of God of complete quiescence, where God is infinite. And God is like, Baba compared God to being like an infinite shoreless ocean in a state of quiescence. And in this state, God was infinitely unconscious of who he was. And I want to say at the outset, Baba uses the masculine gender when he talks about God. If this was all given in the 1950s, if he were giving it today, maybe he would use they or something like that. But he uses he, and I'll stick with that because he used it. But Baba said that in the beginningless beginning, God was in this quiescent, infinite state of an infinite shoreless ocean. And Baba said, in that infinite shoreless ocean, it was completely quiescent. That there was no disturbance, except something happened in that infinite shoreless ocean, and there was a disturbance that occurred. And Baba called that disturbance a whim, or the initial urge, or sometimes he called it the lahar, which is a Vedantic term. And it's just an urge, Baba said. He said there's no other word for it. It's just, something happened where God had this urge, and the urge was to know who he was. There was some kind of experience of, I am something, and I don't know what it is. I want to know what it is. And that urge then had to give rise to a medium by which God could know who he was. And so that medium was then what Baba said, the medium became what we call creation. And creation is something that exists that is purely to help God from the beyond state answer that question, that initial question, who am I? Because God was infinite consciousness, but was infinitely unconscious of its infinite consciousness. These things are very hard to understand, that they're so beyond us, but that's what Baba said. And so creation itself, Baba said, is an act of imagination by God to create a vehicle by which God can answer this question. And so creation came out of God. Now, sometimes we say we might say, well, creation, and use the word interchangeably with the term universe. And it's kind of interesting. And I think the concept of universe is big enough to accommodate what we're going to be talking about here. But just to say, even back in the 1920s, Baba started talking about that there were actually multiple universes. In fact, Baba said there's like there's just universe after universe. And it's interesting that science has also caught up with this. And more recently, you see the term, scientists use the term multiverse, which refers to the notion that there are actually multiple universes, but we'll stick with universe. And so God, from the beyond state, created this phenomenon called creation. And this is the vehicle by which that God could know himself. Now, how did God enter into creation? That if you think of of God in the beyond state as an infinite ocean, then it kind of oozes it. And this is my term, that God oozes into creation drop by drop from that infinite ocean. And it oozes into creation from a point that Baba calls the point. And that's, if you can see my little laser sticker here, this is kind of where the point might be here. And but Baba says that we enter into this as what he calls individual drops. So we're like individual drops in the ocean. And Baba sometimes he uses the word drop souls. He says that one drop at a time of that infinite ocean oozes into creation. And it's interesting to think of it as a drop soul, because the experience of a drop soul is that it's actually separate from the ocean. It experiences itself as other than the ocean, but actually its essence is of the ocean. And once it returns to the ocean, it is indistinguishable from the entire ocean. But as it enters creation, it enters as an individual. So, and what Baba says, and this is an interesting statement. Baba says, in comparison to that infinite, unlimited, and limitless ocean, this iota of ocean, or this drop of the iota of ocean, is most finite and most limited with infinite limitations. That is, the infinitely free iota, that's infinitely free coming from that state of being God, finds itself infinitely bound. That's the condition or the dilemma that the drop soul has when it enters into creation. So when it's in creation, Baba says that once it's in creation, that drop soul, and each of us, Baba would say, is a drop soul, just to be clear. We may not feel like we're a drop soul, but in this metaphor, that's what we are. Baba says that every drop soul is going to go through 3 different phases as it goes about growing, developing its consciousness to the point to which it can actually, that drop soul can answer the primal question of who am I? And in order to be able to answer that fully as I am infinite God, which each one of us, Baba assures us, we will eventually get to, but we're going to go through 3 different phases. And Baba calls the first phase the evolution of consciousness through form. And the second phase will be called reincarnation in the human form. And the third phase, as I referred to this earlier, will be the phase of involution beyond the gross physical form. And so going back to the chart, you can see here that this entire process, we enter from the beyond state into creation, and we enter in, and Baba said, the most finite form of consciousness. Because Baba said everything in creation has consciousness, but we start with the most finite, and the most finite, Baba said, is gaseous forms. And this is part of the evolution of consciousness through form. And we're going to start with very, very elementary forms, and we're going to gradually evolve into more and more complex forms until we reach the human form, when we'll then start the process of reincarnation in the human form, and then that'll prepare us for involution. And it's very important in understanding the evolution of consciousness through form to understand the basic premise, which is consciousness precedes form, not the other way around. In other words, the forms that consciousness gets are the form that are most conducive to that drop soul gaining the experience and development that it needs in that at that point in time, so that it can keep progressing in its effort toward achieving greater and greater consciousness. And so we start with the most elementary forms, and then we move to the next most elementary form, and then the next most elementary form. As we gradually move up forms, we gain more and more consciousness. And Baba says that we start this in the gaseous state. Now, some of us would think, and I could easily say this, well, gas, it's hard to think of gas as having consciousness, much less having a form. But Baba assures us there is forms of gas. And I was looking at this photograph. This is taken from the Hubble telescope, and you can see this is all gas, and it looks to me like there's lots of forms inside this. So so it makes sense to me that in the gaseous state there actually are distinct forms, and each of those distinct forms is inhabited by a drop soul, and that drop soul is getting a certain kind of experience in this form of gas that it's helping to develop at the most finite level, some level of consciousness. And Baba says that learning and that development of that consciousness is lodged somewhere in the consciousness, in that drop soul's, inside that drop soul. He says it can be lodged in one of the bodies, that there's certain bodies that surround that drop soul. It's lodged in one of those bodies. And that's what allows the drop soul to retain the learning from that experience in the gaseous state. And then as it then evolves out of the gaseous state, or it actually evolves within the gaseous state, but as it evolves from form to form to form, it then retains and builds on and integrates the consciousness as it goes, is what Baba said. Now, it's not necessarily true, by the way, that we have one experience in the gaseous state and then move on. Going back to this chart, it's probably many, many experiences in different forms of the gaseous state, because there's probably lots of different kinds of gas, and each one will probably give a different kind of experience. And to go into full consciousness, eventually we're going to have all kinds of experiences, in order to get there. So we really have to have a whole range of experiences within each one of these forms. So it's not like we just have one experience in one form and then move to the next kind of form. But once we're done in the gaseous form, and we've learned a whole lot about what it means to be gas, we're then ready to make this huge advance into the mineral form. And this is where we become minerals and rocks. And again, we probably look at minerals and rocks as saying, well, there's no consciousness in minerals and rocks. But Baba assures us that there is. Now, I don't know what the experimentation is that's gone on about this. I do remember reading many years ago about some experiments that had seemed to indicate that there might be some consciousness in rocks and stones that's been done by scientists. But one thing I did think of is that the indigenous peoples, and certainly many other peoples, including many of our probably ourselves on this call, understand that there's certain properties associated with different kinds of minerals and rocks, and that's why people wear them as amulets or use them for healing purposes and things like that. And it occurs to me that those kinds of qualities that these stones and minerals have may well be representative of the kinds of experience that the drop soul is having in those that are inhabiting those minerals and so on, and that they're sort of imbibing something about those qualities that again add to their progression of consciousness. Baba never said that, but that's just a speculation on my part. But as we then progress from the mineral form, and we go through many different kinds of mineral forms. Again, it's not just one. And again, this is not a short process, just to say. So we understand this isn't. I don't think it's the case where you spend a year or two in the form of a quartz rock and then you go on to another stone like that. I think it's probably time. There's probably long periods of time that we inhabit these things to gain the experiences we need. But when we're ready, we then move into the vegetable form. And there's so many different kinds of experiences that vegetation can have. We can live in the ground, we can live above ground, we can be leafy, we can have sharp needles, all kinds of experiences that help round out, are helping provide the foundation for rounding out our consciousness. Now, again, do vegetables have consciousness? Well, this is one where we actually do have more and more scientific evidence to support it. The great Indian scientist Bose, back in the early 1900s, did experiments that showed that there was consciousness and that the plants would have had certain kinds of reactions. And I remember a book back in the, in the 1980s or 90s called The Secret Life of Plants that pulled together a lot of that kind of that kind of knowledge that's indicated that plants have consciousness. I remember I tease my wife sometimes, who's vegetarian, about coming after the broccoli with the scissors, and the broccoli freaks out when they see the scissors coming at them. And I don't know if that's really true or not, but it is true. And one of the things that most recently has been very popular is this notion that about trees. That trees, it turns out, and this is very good scientific evidence, trees live in families very often, and they communicate with each other. And there's something called a mother tree. There was one of the top 10 books on the New York Times bestseller list called In Search of the Mother Tree. And that there's a mother tree that looks out for the other trees. And when they understand, however they get this information, that there are trees in their family that are in distress, they actually send nutrients and resources to those trees in distress through an underground fungal network. So there is communication that takes place in the vegetable world, even though it's not obvious to us necessarily how that happens. But when we have sufficient experience in the vegetable world, then we're ready to graduate into the world of insects. And again, we're now at a pretty advanced stage. If you look at it through this lens, you start to say, these insects, they really are something. And it was interesting in Meher Baba's own life, he was very careful not to step on ants and be very careful about insects like that, and not to disturb them, because they have consciousness. They are evolving beings, and there's different kinds of experiences they have. As an ant, you learn the experience of cooperative life. As a butterfly, you learn the experience of metamorphosis, and so on. All kinds of different experiences that the drop soul gets. And as they continue to grow their consciousness, continue to gain these impressions or sanskaras from these different experiences that get lodged into their, being, and that now allow them to progress into the form of reptiles. I live in Myrtle Beach, and in Myrtle Beach, of course, we have alligators, and these are actually crocodiles, I think, but all kinds of experiences that we get in the reptile world. Of some of us we were slithering, or we were amphibian, or we were highly aggressive, or we were not very highly aggressive, or whatever it is. But lots of different experiences in this realm, again, to continue to grow our consciousness till we then have the experience of being a fish, and we learn the experience of living in the water. And then we have the experience of being birds, and we have the experience of flight. Sometimes, again, this isn't something Baba said, but I thought for myself that, a lot of us, as we get interested in these higher states of consciousness, and sometimes there's this urge to somehow inwardly experience inward flight. And I sometimes wonder, well, maybe that comes from impressions we had when we were birds, that sort of very deeply lodged impressions, where somehow we know that there is some kind of exhilaration and some kind of fulfillment and joy in flight. And then from there, then we progress all the way into the animal world. And this, of course, is a huge world with so many different species, that so many different kinds of experiences in this world. And these experiences progress from one animal form to the next, and the next, and the next. So it's not like we have one animal experience. We have many, 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 many animal experiences. As we grow, we progress, we learn stuff about ambulation, we learn stuff about parenting, we learn stuff about working in groups, we learn stuff about how to live alone, on our own, in solitude. so many different kinds of experience that we accrue in the animal world, and then eventually we get in, to the very top of the animal world, and we're almost human-like there, and we have so many human characteristics, and so we've reached almost the pinnacle, and this is really the end. This form right here is the very end of the form of the phase that Baba called evolution of consciousness through form. And when we have done that, and we've learned all these incredible lessons from all these different lifetimes, and they've lodged in consciousness, Baba says consciousness is now actually full and complete, and we end up in the human form. This is the culmination of the evolution of consciousness, is the human form. And Baba says, actually, it's all, the consciousness is done here. It's full and complete. So we say to ourselves, well, if it's full and complete, game over. I must already be there at the goal. But then we look at ourselves, I look at myself and say, well, I don't think I'm there. I don't think I'm fully conscious. I don't think I'm fully, I'm not God realized. I'm not infinite in consciousness. Why not? And the answer is really quite simple, is because I have the residue of the impressions I've gained throughout the entire extremely long process. And Baba says it's millions of lifetimes before we get to the human form. So just to keep in mind, I keep that in mind when I look around and I see people, and I sort of, my own inclination might be to pass judgment on this person or that person. And then I have to remind myself, that person has achieved something incredible by getting to the human form. To get there, they've gone through this amazing process of evolution, and they're in this human form. But we are burdened with our history. We're burdened with the residue of all the impressions we've gained all the way up to that point in time. And those residues, that residue of impressions becomes like a veil. And that veil keeps us from seeing who we really are. And somehow, if we have all of those impressions, they have to be worked through. So if I've been aggressive and I've experienced aggression, if I've experienced myself as an aggressor, and I've had many, many lifetimes as an aggressor by the time I get to human form, it's not like one lifetime, it's many, 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 many lifetimes as an aggressor, I have very strong impressions that tell me I'm an aggressor, because that's what the impressions do. They tell us who we are. And so when the impressions tell me I'm an aggressor, I'm going to have some counter impressions to balance those out. So I have a balanced view of who I am and say, I'm not really an aggressor. But to balance them out, I have to have opposite experiences. That's why we say, and Baba says, this is the world of duality. We're going to have to go through opposites of experiences, in order to eventually balance. Every experience we have is going to have to be balanced out by its opposite. So here we are now, and here we've reached the very beginning. We've gotten here, see all these animals, we get into the ape, and now here we are at the very beginning of this journey that Baba calls reincarnation. And we're now in the experience of the human form, and we're going to experience the human form. But we start out already with this huge burden of impressions. And Baba calls those impressions we've gotten through the evolution of consciousness through forms, he calls them natural sanskaras, or natural impressions. And they're natural because they're just attendant upon, you have to get those impressions just to get to the human form. So they're just natural. So we're going to have to work through those natural impressions. Well, that would seem to be, a straightforward process. Like, okay, let's kind of, let's now go through a process of just, working off of the natural impressions and get all the experience of opposites and get the balance out of those. But it should be straightforward, except for one other minor thing, which is not a minor thing, which is now, in addition to the burden of sanskaras or impressions we have from our evolution through form, we are actually going to start accruing impressions from our experience in the human form. So the things that we do are not necessarily just playing out what takes place through the evolution of consciousness through forms, but we start to have experiences that are kind of new experiences that really are just a function of us being human beings, and those experiences are then going to add more impressions to our burden. And Baba calls those impressions unnatural impressions or unnatural sanskaras, and we start to accumulate those. And we start to have lots of different kinds of experiences because, again, we're going to have, if we're going to go to full consciousness, we need to experience everything. We need to understand and come to grips with everything. So we're going to have to be poor in some lifetimes, and then we're going to have to balance that out by being wealthy. We're going to be men, and then we're going to be women. We're going to be Easterners, and we're going to be Westerners. We're going to be very smart, and we're going to be not so very smart. We're going to have all kinds of experiences of all types that we're going to have as human beings as we go through the reincarnation process, as we sort of continue to refine our consciousness and gather more and more impressions so we have more and more understanding about things. I was thinking about this whole thing, just, about the balancing out of sanskaras, and it's something that I think we've all experienced maybe many, many, many times, but I was thinking, just as by way of example, what does it mean to balance out an impression or balance out a sanskara? And I thought of a very simple example that I thought I'd share with you, which is I had some friends many years ago, a couple who went through a divorce, and it was a very, very difficult thing for them, as it always is for anybody that goes through divorce. And I found myself siding with and aligning with one of the people in the couple, and really joined that person in sort of being critical of and probably backbiting the other person. And Baba said backbiting, by the way, is one of the major ways that we gain new binding sanskaras. So Baba really was very strong about not doing backbiting, but I was doing it, not. And then a number of years later, I went through a divorce myself, and I found that there were people that I felt were backbiting me. And I found out how incredibly painful that was to have done the backbiting. And I went back to the person who I had done the backbiting with afterwards, and I apologized and asked for forgiveness for that. And that really helped balance out that tendency to sort of pass judgment on that kind of person. And I'm just giving you that as a way, because we've all had those experiences of sort of having some experience of one type and then finding ourselves having the opposite experience, and somehow having learned from that to, that somehow it soothed or calmed down or helped center and ground us by having that balancing experience. And Baba said that that's really what we go through this entire process of reincarnation, is really balancing out experiences so that we stop our mind from taking one side or another side, but we end up getting more and more balance and more quiet inside of our being. And as we get more and more quiet inside of our being, as we work through these sanskaras, we get freer inside of ourselves. And eventually we get to a point where we're so free inside of ourselves that we actually are quiet enough inside of ourselves that we start to have some insight. And that insight says, if I'm not just this kind of person or that kind of person, if I'm not just fully identified as a male or a female, or just poor or rich, and I start to let go of these, what Baba calls the false identities that we've gained through all of these different experiences, and as they start to get quieter, then this question starts to grow inside of us. And the question is, well, if I'm not all these different things that I thought I was, and if I'm really not identifying so much with my gender, with my role, with my profession, with my social status or my economic status or whatever it is, as those identities start to quiet down through the balancing out of these sanskaras, then this other question starts to grow inside of us. And that question is, if I'm not all these things, who am I? And that question, when it starts to be more conscious in us, is actually the seeds of the spiritual path. That's when the seedling of the spiritual path actually starts, when I start asking the question, who am I? And that's, once we've reached that, we're kind of getting close to the end of this huge chain of reincarnation. And it's a long chain. And I don't want to depress anybody, but Baba said the average human being goes through 8,400,000 lifetimes in the human form before it gets to God. That's a long, 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 long time to get there. And if we're on this call and and all of us are starting to ask that question, or maybe far along in asking that question, we're probably pretty near the end of those 8,400,000 lifetimes, and we're getting ready then to go to the next phase of consciousness, of our journey of consciousness. And this is the phase called involution of consciousness. And this is the experience that Baba gives, that Baba has described in great detail in God Speaks and other places. And I think it's really a huge contribution to spiritual literature, what Baba gave us about what is involution and what is the path of involution. And Baba explained that there are 6 different planes of consciousness beyond what we experience as the gross physical plane. And he went some depth, into great depth, about what are the experiences one has on those different planes of consciousness. And I think that's something that I would think that every single one of us in here would be intrigued by and interested in. And that really will be the subject of our next call next week, will be about involution. But I want to say what I've described, that Bob has described for us, is a huge, long, arduous path from start with gas all the way through all the different forms into the human form, and then 8,400,000 lifetimes in the human form to get to finally answering that question that was originally asked by God in the beyond state of who am I? And Baba said the ultimate answer is I am God. And Baba, this is what Baba said. He said the happiness of God realization is self-sustained, eternally fresh and unfading, boundless and indescribable. It is for this happiness that the world has sprung into existence. Baba says, with all the arduousness and all the heartache and all the effort involved, it's worth it to go there. So this is the divine theme. As I said, next time we'll talk about the path of involution. I want to close the presentation by reading a poem. And this is a poem in God Speaks, and it's a poem by Rumi. It's the only poem, I think, in God Speaks. And God Speaks was given in the 50s, way before the name Rumi was a well-known name in the New Age community. But it's a poem that really captures the essence of God Speaks, which is, I believe, why it's in the book. And Rumi says, I died as a mineral and became a plant. I died as a plant and rose animal. I died as animal and I was man. Why should I fear? When was I less by dying? Yet once more I shall die as man, to soar with angels blessed. But even from angelhood I must pass on. All except God doth perish. When I have sacrificed my angel soul, I shall become what no mind e'er conceived. Oh, let me not exist, for non-existence proclaims in organ tones, to him we shall return. I'm going to ask we end with just another moment of silence, just to take in what we've just talked about. So as a reminder, we'll have session 2 on involution next October 10th, next Sunday, 8 o'clock Eastern time. We will be posting the link to this program on the website. You can get more information at the website, journeyofconsciousness.org. I just want to express really deep appreciation to folks who have advised me in this program, Rich Bloom, Molly Leach, James O.D. and Ward Parks. And I want a special shout out to my technology partner on this, Ali Lawton, who's been helping us here and is continuing to help. And I think with that, I'm gonna, there we are. I think we're gonna turn the recording off, Ali. And I think we're gonna